Welcome to the archive, Steve Friesen. I hope I said that correctly.
Friesen.
Friesen.
Friesen. As in, it's going to be freezing cold here in a few days. It's going to be about 5 degrees. Yeah, we're trying to catch up with Maine in terms of cold weather.
Nice. That's shorts weather for me. I sweat when it's 25 degrees outside. Um, so we're going to talk about today a very interesting character, not just in world history, but particularly American history. Buffalo Bill. This is a big one. This is one of the biggest figures in all of American history, and we are going to explore why. The man, the myth, and the legacy. Um, Growing up, every kid in America hears about cowboys, hears about the Wild West, and at some point, whether or another, whether the history of it is true or false, we all hear about Buffalo Bill. And I'm
Mhm.
pretty sure Buffalo Bill is the image that comes to mind for anybody who is not from America and has studied a little bit of American history or has at least looked at the Midwest. And let's hop into it, Steve.
Okay. Well, he does encapsulate that. And, one of the things that I think sets America apart historically, in comparison, let's say, to Europe, where they have a much deeper history, longer history in some ways, is the American West. People are fascinated by it. Um, I was in Munich, Germany, sitting in a teepee having barbecue beef with a German who on the weekends would go and pretend he was an Indian. Now, there's some people that are insulted by that, but these guys, they admire the American Indian culture. They admire the story of America. And the reason I was there was they, of course, admired Buffalo Bill. So I went into their saloon in the middle of Munich, and we had, a Coors, and we sat around talking about the American West and its history. So that's repeated throughout the world. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my most recent book, Galloping Gourmet: Eating and Drinking with Buffalo Bill. People eat and drink with Buffalo Bill, figuratively or symbolically, around the world. There's bars in Congo named after Buffalo Bill. There are bars in Brazil named after Buffalo Bill. And of course, people, when they think about eating the way you eat in the Wild West, they're thinking about steaks, roast beef, barbecue beef, and it's Buffalo Bill that's kind of at the base of that. One of the things I even explored was Buffalo Bill and corn. He helped introduce the consumption of corn to Europe. There's one of the things I read that said the imports of corn from the United States to Europe greatly increased during the time that his show was traveling across Europe. And there was even a newspaper article that said Buffalo Bill is teaching Paris to eat popcorn. They had not had popcorn before. After that, it became very popular. So Buffalo Bill was somebody who introduced the world to what was going on in the West, whether it be something like the Pony Express, and I know you want to talk about that later, or it was something like the food that they ate in the West. He was somebody who introduced it not just to America, but he introduced it certainly to Europe and the rest of the world. So there you go.
All right.
Oh, and I can't leave out one more. Basically, he is one of the persons who has been credited with introducing rodeo or promoting rodeo and the concept of rodeo. He's considered one of the founders of American rodeo. And that's big too, because that obviously helps continue the story of the American West and what happens out here.
Yeah, even in the modern day, if you go to agricultural fairs, uh, there's rodeo. I saw a rodeo this October.
All right, that's good. I love the bull riding, but those guys got to be brave.
That's
There's
good.
some big Angus bulls at our stock shows. And of course, the buffalo get quite large too. And every year, somebody gets either killed or badly hurt in Yellowstone because they try and pet them. They try and pet the buffalo. And they even put up signs everywhere that say, "Don't pet the fuzzy cows."
Yep, don't pet the fuzzy cows. So, so let's get to the beginning with Buffalo. Where does Buffalo Bill's journey start?
He starts in Iowa. He's born in LeClaire, Iowa, along the Mississippi River. And at the age of 8, his father decides to move west. They're opening up land in Kansas. So they land on the Missouri River, right near Kansas border. And all you have to do is cross the river. You're in the territory of Kansas. And as soon as they open up the territory, his family goes in and they settle in northeast Kansas near Leavenworth. And of course, Leavenworth itself becomes part of many of the stories of the West. And this is where Buffalo Bill then grows up. But the first thing he sees, one of the first things he sees when they arrive in Missouri at the Missouri River, is they see this long procession of wagons getting ready to go out on the Oregon Trail. And Buffalo Bill, at the age 8, says to his parents, "I want to do that. I want to do that." And that's by the time he's 11, he does that. He's on an early train. I should say, as an early boy, he travels on the Oregon Trail. By the age 14, he's going independently. He's not with his family anymore. He's one of the breadwinners of his family, and he's becoming a teamster on the Oregon Trail. So he grows up in the great American West, and growing up, he does just about everything. He actually comes to Colorado as part of the gold rush here in 1859. He fails. He doesn't find anything, just like any of the others. He does some herding cattle, does a little cowboy work. He rides in the Pony Express. During the Civil War, he's in the Civil War. He kind of experiences the whole bleeding Kansas era before the Civil War and gets caught in some of those conflicts. He does just about everything. So by the time this kid is 20, 21, he's done it all. And he begins scouting by that time. He's a scout out on the western plains of Kansas, scouting. And then, of course, he hunts buffalo for the railroad for meat. And he is so good that he earns this nickname, Buffalo Bill. So that happens in about 1870, well, actually, even a little before 1870, 1869, 1870. And this is before the hide hunters come out and start decimating the herds. Buffalo Bill is a hunter for meat, and his largest group of buffalo, or number of buffalo that he ever kills, is during that time for meat, and that's it. There are millions of buffalo out here at that time. But because he gets that name Buffalo Bill, later on, people confuse him with the people that really were just about wiping out the herds. And unfortunately, today, folks who don't know what they're talking about will say, "Oh, Buffalo Bill was one of the big leaders of killing the buffalo off." And there's no truth to that.
Hmm. Do we know if it was like a specific company or a group of people, or were these just hunters that just went out and killed them and sold the hide?
Hunters went out and they sold it to whoever would buy the hides. And of course, the whole point of the hides is it's very tough leather, and they needed it for all the good folks back east, part of the Industrial Revolution in America going on in northeast United States and well, all along the eastern seaboard and elsewhere, even into Ohio and places like that. These are used with all of the factories for all of those pulleys and everything else that they use to propel the industrial revolution forward. And that's what is really responsible for the death of so many of those buffalo. So they kill them, they skin them, they send the hides back east, and they leave the rest of the body, the rest of the buffalo, to rot on the plains. Carcasses all across the plains. Later on, people will gather up the buffalo bones. You'll see big piles of them being ready to shipped back east. They grind them up and they put them in salt and sugar to keep it from binding. You know, if it gets damp, it gets hard. That helps keep them loose. And they have other uses for the buffalo bones. So they do use those as well. But by the time all those bones are being gathered, the buffalo are pretty much gone.
Wow. Ouch.
It's a sad story, and it happens very quickly. And Buffalo was one of the first to say, this is wrong. They're being killed in massive numbers, and not a voice is being raised to stop it. And he was quite upset by that.
Yeah, that is upsetting. Um, I heard also there was kind of one of those that other bad side of the Wild West. I don't know if this is true or not, but there were also not necessarily just hunters, but there were people traveling to the West that, as something they wanted to check off their list of things to do, was shoot a buffalo for.
Mhm.
Mhm.
They did that and shot from the trains. There's been much said about them shooting buffalo from the train, and that certainly happened. But shooting buffalo from a train is not a very effective way to hunt buffalo. So I don't know that that would be really responsible for the decimation. There are a variety of factors that helped, reduce their numbers, but it was primarily this hunting by the hide hunters. The problem is buffalo aren't particularly intelligent about things like that. And so they would be using these guns that could be firing from hundreds and hundreds of yards away. And you wouldn't even hear a sound to speak of when they fired the gun. And the buffalo would just be grazing and they just start picking them off one by one. And it's almost like, hey, what happened to Joe over there? He just fell, you know. The buffalo had no idea why they were dying, and they would just continue eating. And so they could wipe out a good portion of a herd, and then they'd send in the people that skinned the hides. They'd load up a wagon and take it to the nearest railroad depot and send it back east where it'd be made into leather goods of all kinds, but particularly to use in the factories. So
Yeah,
so that's one of the things that people get wrong about Buffalo Bill. But we probably want to talk maybe a little bit about his early start. He got all these accolades as a scout for the Army as well. He received the Medal of Honor from Congress in 1872. So, you know, he was the real thing in terms of his work as a scout. It was during the Union Wars. The Indians and were upset, the Lakota particularly, with the intrusion of the white people in such great numbers. At first, they were welcoming. Oh, good, we can live side by side, but that didn't work very long. And so their fights, basically, it culminates in what today we often refer to as the Union Wars. And Buffalo Bill, because he was a good hunter, he knew the West. He was recruited to be a scout for the Army. And he got involved in a couple of battles, but it was one of those things, kill or be killed. They were going to kill him or vice versa. He killed very few Indians, though, despite some of the stories that are out there. So, and it was in a battle situation.
yeah,
But because of that, he gained quite a reputation. There are stories about what a great scout he was. He was a very good scout. The scouts were not often in the battle. They would only be shooting if they had to do it to defend themselves. But he was a very good scout. And when the stories went out back east, he became a person who had a good reputation for doing that. Eventually, a guy named Ned Buntline writes a novel about him, a dime novel, which is, I would say, about 90% not true. It was exaggerating things, but Buffalo Bill was a character he could capitalize on and gave Buffalo Bill even more of a reputation. And they went to, he went to visit New York City. He was welcomed as sort of a hero when he came to New York City, and also a bit of an oddity walking around in his buckskins looking like somebody quite unlike somebody else who's walking down Fifth Avenue, and he becomes quite popular in society there, and he goes to see a play based on Ned Buntline's novel. And again, like the novel, not a lot of truth to it, but he gets recognized. Here's the real Buffalo Bill, and everybody stands up and claps for him. And he gets an idea. He thinks, there's this guy on stage playing me. I could play me, and I could make some money. And that's pretty much how he got involved in show business. And from there, it just kept building. And I'll let you ask a question. I just go on, you push a button, and I just keep talking. So I better stop.
Yeah. So he started as an actor. He saw this plane, he starts playing himself.
Yes.
And so was it the same play? Did he want to correct the play at all?
He didn't try to correct the play. They came up with a new play. And these were melodramas. And I would say they were about probably 60% sort of made up on the spot almost. They had scripts. And at the Buffalo Bill Museum and Grave, where I worked for 22 years up on Lookout Mountain here outside of Denver, they have one of those original scripts. So it's kind of interesting to see that original script. And it's one of those things where they're improvising a great deal. But people wanted to see this famous character, Buffalo Bill. And imagine you're living somewhere in New York City, Cincinnati, any number of eastern cities, and you're reading about these people in the newspaper, and then you read these dime novels. Here's your chance to see the real thing when Buffalo Bill comes to town in a play. And so that's what he does. He does that for 10 years. And then he gets an idea. He thinks, I'm making good money doing this, but I could do even better. And I could show people the way the West really is, because that seems to be what they want to see. And so he creates this Wild West show with a big outdoor arena and literally hundreds of performers and the animals from the West. He brings the people and the animals from the West and shows them all over the United States and Europe. And that's how we see the first promotion of of the West by Buffalo Bill. Again, I better give you a chance to ask more questions, but it's such a wonderful story to tell how this all worked for him.
Yeah. So before we get into the show,
Sure.
it's one of the juiciest parts of the whole story. Um, So there is, I heard that there's a lot of talk about him in Pony Express.
That's a point of controversy between historians. There are some of us when we get together, we just sometimes choose not to bring it up because people get kind of hot under the collar over this one. But Buffalo Bill, in my opinion, yes, was part of the Pony Express. And the reason I think that, several reasons, but one of them is people who were in the Pony Express, including Alexander Majors, who is one of the founders of the Pony Express, said, yeah, he was in the Pony Express. So you go to the original people who were also writers, documented writers in the Pony Express, and they said, yeah, Buffalo Bill was in the Pony Express. But I think there's another sort of logical thing about the Pony Express that makes a big difference, and that is the Pony Express was no big deal. It was a big deal because people got the mail, but there were other sort of smaller versions of the Pony Express elsewhere in the United States. And it was not very successful. It didn't last very long because the telegraph came in and it was not necessary to have a Pony Express. So it didn't last very long. And I think Buffalo Bill sensed that this was an important part of the early frontier history, the early history of America. And so he, almost from the beginning, starts showing sort of mock rides, if you will, of the Pony Express as part of his Wild West show. He starts promoting the Pony Express. So 2 shows a day, hundreds and hundreds of towns across America for 30 years. He's promoting the Pony Express as being an important event, an important part of American history. I think that's the reason the Pony Express became famous. I think the Pony Express became famous because of Buffalo Bill, not the other way around. And if you start looking at it from that perspective, you begin to realize, why would he be promoting something that he wasn't part of? Why would he even mention it? Because there were so many other things he could have mentioned. But for the most part, he always includes acts of some kind that were things that occurred on the Western plains in Western America. He wouldn't include an act unless it was something he felt he had some connection to. So that's my rationale, if you will. But there are some other people who say, well, there was no written record of him being in the Pony Express, no roll, if you will, list of names that included his name. But I think you don't need to have his name, because there were other people whose names weren't included that are documented as being in the Pony Express. So I don't know if that puts that to bed for the moment, but it does from my perspective.
Okay. Well, I mean, that does make a really valid point, though, as to why he would be, and it makes more sense too with the controversy. It wasn't very big at the time it was there. It wasn't the most popular known thing. And then Buffalo Bill could have very well made his own controversy by promoting it within his show.
Yeah, yeah, he really, I think, he was a master promoter. And he had a guy named John Burke who was even better. Actually, people who are in marketing often, if they're looking at the history of marketing in the United States, they'll read about John Burke and what he did for Buffalo Bill. And they were master promoters. And Buffalo Bill, of course, had the charisma, and he was a master storyteller. So he was somebody who could do this. And it almost, if it hadn't been if it hadn't been Buffalo Bill, it might have been somebody else. But it was Buffalo Bill. He was the right person at the right time and did it in the right way.
Yeah. Now he was also a war hero. You talked that he was in the Civil War, and then he was in the wars between the native tribes and the U.S. government. Um, so how did he get involved with the whole Civil War thing?
So I include this in my book on eating and drinking particularly with Buffalo Bill. His mother died about 1863. His mother died. He was so close to his mother. He went on a bender. He had already learned about drinking from all those other teamsters in the wagon trains, and he had drunk alcohol. But he said he went. He actually says this. I went on a several week went on a bender for several weeks, and awoke to discover I had enlisted in the Kansas Volunteer Army for the Civil War. He basically got drunk and signed up for to be in the war, quite unwittingly. And
Okay, I think that's the greatest sign up for the war ever.
yeah, it was. I think it was in the Seventh Kansas Cavalry. He signed up as a volunteer with it, and then when he sobered up, he discovered he had committed. He had signed up.
Oh
So,
my God. Okay. All right. That's one for the books right there. Um, so I'm a little curious. So with the war between the tribes and with the government, um, so he was obviously a scout. He's doing his job. He might have been in some situations where he had to either kill or be killed. Um, but how did this impact him? He grew up kind of in the more less inhabited area of America during the time when people were starting to go out further out west, where it wasn't inhabited by people with European ancestry like us. Um, how so did he ever write about that? Did he ever was he ever affected by what happened?
well, he did his autobiography, and I use him quite a bit in some of my work. Of course, other things too, but he did write um, one autobiography and some other memories of his growing up. But one of the things he write about, one of the things is that they were where they were located in Kansas was right near the Kickapoo tribe. So there was that tribe and some other tribes that were still in northeastern Kansas, and they had very peaceful relations. And he actually played with young Kickapoo boys who were going to school with him when he was quite young. So he got to know his first his first experience of Native Americans were very positive. They were very positive experiences, and I think that laid a groundwork for an attitude that he maintained the rest of his life. So he was somebody who spent time in the plains, working as a teamster, doing hunting and things like that. So he was an ideal person to be a scout, not only because of his ability to work in the plains, his knowledge of the plains, and his hunting ability, but because of his ability to communicate with the various Indian groups that he was working with out there. And if you were going to be a good scout, you had to know the people you were working with. You might not be friends with the Lakota because they're your enemies, but you're friends with the Pawnee because the Pawnee actually became allies to the American Army, the U.S. Army. And so many of them became scouts as well. So Buffalo Bill knew the Native Americans with whom he was working, and he was able to, because of that, be a better scout. So this is kind of a different relationship. You know, we're not looking at a monolithic group when we look at all these different Indian tribes. They actually fought with each other as well. And so in the case of the Pawnee, they were bitter enemies with the Lakota. And so in their case, they thought, well, we'll become allies with the U.S. Army. So that enemy thing turned into being a good thing for the U.S. Army, if you will. So this is going on out here. It's really quite a mixture, and it's not easy to generalize about what was happening out here at the time, because there were even cases where the U.S. Army had to intervene and keep their Pawnee allies from massacring some of the Lakota. And same time, you had the Cheyenne who were involved with this. So there are all these different tribes throughout the American West. They're not always agreeing with each other. The Crow become scouts for the U.S. Army as well, because they're kind of enemies of the Lakota and some of the other groups that are out in here. So this is a mess, but they're all warriors. That's the thing. There's an honor in being a warrior in these different tribes. And after the war, what happens is they expected to be treated by warriors, by other warriors, to be treated with respect, and that doesn't happen. Um, but Buffalo Bill respected them. And so they actually became his friends. So the Lakota, previous enemies, became close friends to Buffalo Bill, and he became their ally. And he spoke out on behalf of their rights. He hired them. He hired them and paid them equal wages for working in his show. And if you go to Pine Ridge, even today, there are stories of members of the family who at one time were part of Buffalo Bill's show and were paid very well. And they loved being able to get off the reservation and to recapture a little bit of the wild life that they once experienced on the plains. So, and that's the subject of another one of my books called Lakota Performers in Europe. I deal with how these Wild West shows actually were very beneficial to the American Indians who got involved with them. Not always. I mean, there were people who are abusive of their employees, just like today, unfortunately. But that was going on.
Remarkable.
Again, yeah, these stories, there are so many stories to tell about what's going on. And that's why you finally have to write a couple of books. So,
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much that's so much to unpack. So now I see why he starts having um Sitting Bull in his show.
mhm.
And this was something that occurred to me a couple of years ago when I started rewatching. So, when I went to film school, one of the gen eds was film history. So Edison's first six films he made in his studio, two of them were of, I want to say Sioux ghost dancers, and the one where there's the amassed group, It's about 17 seconds long. They're all doing the dance. Um, there's a little tag right on the corner that says Buffalo Bills Show.
Hmm.
Piece of paper left. That is, to me, that is so wild that this guy even made film history. His one of his acts was one of the very first movies ever made.
That is pretty amazing. In fact, Edison also filmed Annie Oakley doing sharpshooting as part of one of his films that he did very early.
Yeah, that video is impressive. You do get to see just how good she is. Um, and from everything I've heard, she's the real deal as far as
Oh, yeah.
being able to shoot a cigarette somebody lit in their hand while looking through a hand mirror, shoot it like right behind her. And
She
he,
was amazing.
yeah,
She was amazing, and she deserves all the credit that she gets because she was very good at what she did. And but one other thing about Edison, actually, Edison and Buffalo Bill were at least business friends. They met each other. Actually, they met each other in Paris when Buffalo Bill was performing in Paris at the exposition in 1889 when they opened up the Eiffel Tower. And Buffalo Bill hosted Thomas Edison for a breakfast there, a huge breakfast, put on a big spread for him. And this was the beginning of a business relationship. Buffalo Bill later on hires the Edison Company to provide lighting for his shows so he can do nighttime shows. So, and I have some pictures where you can actually see these large globe lights that were hanging all around the seating, and they had three spotlights that they used, and they paid Edison's company to provide all of those. So he forged this business relationship, and then Edison also continues to film Buffalo Bill, and he does a filming of some parades, a parade in New York City. He actually, and there is footage that he did of the Wild West show at the Wild West show because he was thinking at one point Edison was thinking of creating a movie about Buffalo Bill's Wild West, but he never got to it. But at any rate, that relationship was close. And then also one more thing about Edison, he actually recorded Buffalo Bill's voice. There is a recording of Buffalo Bill's voice done by Thomas Edison, and we use it in one of our exhibits up at the Buffalo Bill Museum on Lookout Mountain. So it's an interesting relationship that happens there, and this speaks to the number of people that somebody like Buffalo Bill got to meet and work with because of his own notoriety. He had tea with Oscar Wilde, for example, when they were in London. Buffalo Bill was rubbing elbows with the leading people of his day and with the leading minds of his day. And you just wonder what some of those conversations must have been like.
I would have loved to have been a fly in that wall. So he was in England, he's in the United Kingdom, he's in France. Where else in Europe did he go?
He went all over. He went two different times. He was there from 1887 to basically about 1892. And then again, he goes back in 1902 and stays till 1906. So, with that kind of time spent traveling around Europe, you can imagine he really embedded this idea of American Wild West and the Wild West culture into the psyche, if you will, of people in Europe. So that today, you talk about Buffalo Bill in Europe, a lot more people, I think, know of Buffalo Bill in Europe than actually know of Buffalo Bill in the United States at this point. And, when I've traveled in Europe, I'll talk with people. Oh, Buffalo Bill, he was in our town. He spent a whole year traveling around France. He spent a whole year traveling around Great Britain, and literally stayed there for a number of months in some cases. He performed for Queen Victoria in 1887 when his show was there. They did a special command performance for Queen Victoria. They even built a large stadium outside of London where they could perform. And they were there for a number of months in Great Britain performing, and everybody went. The Prince of Wales, the Princess of Wales went there, and they enjoyed some drinks, some American cocktails while they were at the bar at Buffalo Bill's Wild West. They hosted all sorts of people. And then they went to, as I said, they sold popcorn to the French. And it was a new thing. The French found it quite fascinating. In fact, after Buffalo Bill's show left, it was still popular. And there was a theater critic that complained when he went to the theater in Paris, he had trouble hearing the actors talk because everybody was crunching the popcorn. So you have this going on. Now, a lot of this has been forgotten, which is part of why I did my book on it. But all these fascinating tidbits. Here's another fascinating tidbit. Buffalo Bill opened the first Mexican restaurant east of the Mississippi in 1886. He opened one in Madison Square Garden, and that's the first Mexican food served in the city, and helped propel interest in tamales. They started not long after his show left. Tamale carts became all the rage. Now you go, you get a nice hot dog, right? Hot dog carts, they're all over, I assume. Last time I was in New York City, it was that way. Can you imagine tamale carts all over New York City for a while? So,
Wow. Tamale. Oh my God. I'm trying to visualize that. I mean, I know how New York would have looked during that time period. I've seen enough pictures between the 1880s into the 1920s, but now
mhm.
to visualize that with tamale carts.
I know. It's great.
I would have loved to have walked around for a day. Oh my God, I wish there were tamale carts. Still, that's incredible. Wow. So
Are
this
you ready for
guy,
one more?
yeah. What else?
Ready? One more bit of food trivia.
Okay, lay it on me.
Okay. Okay. So at London, when Buffalo Bill was there in London in 1887, they had this large area built, an amphitheater built. Around it, all the way around, was a 400-foot bar. And they served what they called American cocktails. And in England at the time, they did not drink cocktails. And one of the main reasons is, and we still find that it's hard to get ice in your drinks in a lot of places in Europe. And my first time in Europe in 1974, you just didn't get ice anywhere. But in London, Buffalo Bill had iced cocktail drinks, and they were kind of an American invention. People don't realize that. American cocktails were kind of a post Civil War invention in the United States. And They hadn't drunk anything like that in Europe, and they particularly in London. And there was again a after Buffalo Bill's Wild West leaves, after they closed down, American bars become very popular where they serve American cocktails with ice in them, and they became very popular. They're still American bars. There's a bar in the Savoy Hotel in London, an American bar where you can get some of those cocktails and American cocktails. Now you can get all sorts of cocktails there, but back in 1887, nobody was drinking cocktails. So that's something else that Buffalo Bill introduced. Was really basically helping introduce American cocktails to London and to England. So there you go.
Remarkable. I mean, this guy, I mean, let's face it, this guy has painted the image of America in other countries.
Hmm.
Because now there's so much that makes sense why cowboys are the stereotype of Americans in any other country. Even companies like Revlon, um, in the 80s, anything that represented America when they were doing advertisements were cowboys. And it's
Hmm.
probably because of him.
Oh yeah, it's he. You can't say he directly did it, but he influenced it. He helped introduce the concept. He made American Western culture popular. And of course, not that it's a good thing. Think of the Marlboro Man.
Yeah,
The Marlboro Man out there in the American West, in Wyoming, actually. He was filmed at a ranch in Wyoming. They filmed those commercials at a ranch in Wyoming. Well, the look of the American cowboy represent was used to promote products of all sorts of kinds, and still today, quite frankly. So,
still are. Um, so, yeah. So what, really, I mean, who are the kinds of people in his show? He has Annie Oakley, he had Sitting Bull, he had Ghost, but who else?
well, he started out with both Lakota and Pawnee as the Indian performers, but they didn't get along very well. And eventually he decided primarily to hire Lakota. That was pretty much after the time when he had Sitting Bull with the show. And Sitting Bull proved to be such a popular performer. He was only with the show for about 4 or 5 months. And then he got tired of doing the show business, and they parted friends. But he had them. He had vaqueros, Mexican vaqueros coming up from southwestern United States and from Mexico, and they would perform. Actually, Jose Jose or Oropeza was a master lasso worker, thrower, whatever you want to call it. Did rope tricks, and he taught Will Rogers how to do rope tricks, and he was quite popular. He was again from that area, from the American Southwest. There were as the show grew, so it starts out with about 400 performers. That's primarily American cowgirls, excuse me, American cowgirls, American cowboys. He had vaqueros. He had various Indians performing. He had some sharpshooters, that kind of thing. But the show grows, and it grows so large that by the time the show closes in 1913, he has over 1,600 people working for the show, and of course many performers. And by that time he has added something called a Congress of Rough Riders of the World. And he's so into horsemanship and wants to show it off. He gets all these horsemen and horsewomen from around the world. So he's added gauchos, he's added Cossacks, he's added Japanese horsemen, he has other kinds of performers. He has contortionists that become part of it who are from the Far East. By the time the show closes, there are people representing every continent on the earth, except Antarctic, of course. But there are people from all over the world performing, showing their skills. Horsemanship is always at the center of it, but other skills as well, acrobats, that kind of thing. Um, so it became one of the diverse multicultural shows touring at that time because of all those people that got brought on to show their skills and their abilities.
And this is also a ticket for people to see the world, really.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of the advertising. You can count on that. That goes
Yeah.
in the advertising. Come see the world. Come to Buffalo Bill's Wild West.
Oh my God. Okay. So this now makes clear sense. I mean, you're not just gonna go and you're gonna see people do things like shoot the cigarette out of someone's hand. You're not just gonna see native people perform. You're gonna see some really wild multicultural acts from horsemen to people from Mexico who can do rope tricks like you wouldn't see anywhere else. That is just nuts.
Well, think about it. The show performs or tours for 30 years. After you've gone 1 or 2 times, what's new? It's kind of like, what's new? What's the new act? Sure, we're going to see the Pony Express. We're going to see Buffalo Bill. You got to see him. We're going to see the Indians. We're going to see some sharpshooting. Okay, what else goes on? Why do I want to go back to the show? You got to keep them coming. And so that's just savvy showmanship. You want to get a few more people. You keep your core acts, but you introduce new material always.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what Taylor Swift does. You know, she's got to do some of her favorite songs, but she has to introduce new songs. That's the way show business has worked for all these years. And of course, Buffalo Bill was savvy enough to know that that had to happen as well with his shows.
Yeah. So what um for Buffalo Bill, um what caused him to have to close the show down?
Well, he wasn't a real good businessman, and that's often the case. You have somebody who's an excellent entrepreneur, but they need a manager running things. And his really good businessman that was working with the show died in about 1903. And at that point, you see him kind of struggling a bit. And this is also a time that movies are starting to be shown and shot and shown. And the cinema cuts into his audiences a little bit. So he's not making the kind of money he used to make. He makes some bad investments as well. So by 1913, um, he's doing okay, but he isn't bringing in the money like he once did. He makes the mistake of borrowing about $20,000 from a Denver businessman named Harry Tammet. And he, again, not a savvy businessman, he signs the note that he will pay the loan back in June. Well, June is just the first couple of months of the show. He's got a whole lot more months to finish off his season. And he hasn't made enough money to pay the 20,000 back to Harry Tamman. At the same time, his business partner at that time ends up booking a show in Denver. And so they're performing in Denver, and that's like a July 12th. Well, he was supposed to pay in June. July 12th, Buffalo Bills Wild West is performing in Denver. The sheriff comes in and closes down the show and takes the show basically because of all the debts that he hasn't paid yet. So this is the end of Buffalo Bills Wild West. Uh, the show is closed down. All the assets are sold. And Buffalo Bill, on top of that, is kind of forced to appear with Harry Tamman's own show, which was a circus. And basically, he has to perform in a circus for a couple of years. As you know, he rides out. Here's the great Buffalo Bill. Now we'll watch the clowns. You know, it's that kind of thing. And Buffalo Bill hates it, but he finally can afford to get away from it and works with another Wild West show for about a year. And at that point, that's 1916. And in late 1960, he gets a very bad cold, the flu, and he's had some other issues going on, and he dies on January 10th. So actually, he dies what we're looking at being just a few days ago. This is the anniversary of Buffalo Bill's death, January 10th. He dies January 10th, 1917. So that kind of wraps that aspect of the story up, I guess. But that's, it is often the case, as I said. You have somebody who's a visionary, an entrepreneur, but they need a good businessman to make sure they don't let things fall apart. And
Yes,
things kind of fall apart
they
for him.
always do. Um,
Yeah.
so now I'm gonna ask the next controversial question. Where he's buried.
Well, he is definitely buried on top of Lookout Mountain, right outside of Denver here, where I worked for 22 years. I was the crypt keeper, if you will. Um, Buffalo Bill is buried there. And there are some rumors that were started by a couple of people, and it's too much to go into. Probably sometime after World War II, I think they just decided, let's do this because Buffalo Bill's buried there, and he should have been buried in Cody, Wyoming instead. And they started this rumor that he's buried on this mountain outside of Cody. But they had an open casket when they buried him here. So if anybody had switched the body in the mortuary, as they have claimed, somebody would have noticed because he had friends and family. About 11,000 people came up to the burial, and many of them would have walked by the casket and taken one last look at Buffalo Bill before he was put in the ground. And after that, there were threats to steal the body. And so Johnny Baker Buffalo Bill's foster son, who'd been a performer with the show, and actually kind of took over watching over the grave and built a gift shop up on Lookout Mountain, things like that. He had about 11 tons of concrete poured over Buffalo Bill and his wife's bodies in the 1920s to settle this issue once and for all. He's not going anywhere. He's got all this concrete over him. So you folks in Cody, Wyoming can just forget about digging this guy up. He's staying right where he is. And of course, he's been there ever since. So that issue is, as far as most people, unless they're really holding on to one of these stories that tend to go around, he is buried on Lookout Mountain. The only issue would be, did he want to be buried on Lookout Mountain? And that's where the controversy comes in again between some of us historians. And of course, again, like the Pony Express thing, we got to have something to argue about. So the question is, did he ask to be buried up there? And his wife and all of his family said, yes, he asked to be buried on Lookout Mountain. And even the priest that ended up baptizing him, he'd been baptized as a baby, but I think he wanted to make sure it somehow or other would take. So he had himself baptized just before he died. He was baptized. And the priest said, yeah, he said he wanted to be buried up on Lookout Mountain. So that's our story, and we're sticking to it on Lookout Mountain. Some of the historians associated with the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming, disagree with that. And so we have interesting conversations because they feel he really did want to be buried in Cody. So,
Okay. Okay. So he did say, so he did mention earlier that he said women can work just as hard as men and they should be paid equally. Um,
right. They can do a job if, yeah, I don't know if he didn't necessarily say they worked as hard, but he said they should be able to do the job, the men, they should be able to compete for that job. Now it depends on what the job is too.
yeah. So I find that very interesting that he was that kind of personality and he was that observant because this was a time period where I still don't think women could really own land. And if they
Oh
did,
no.
it was very, and if they did, it would a very lucrative, difficult, and complicated process.
Well, the whole issue of rights for women, and of course, you look at voting rights, for example, started out here in the West. I mean, it didn't start. There were women advocating in the East as well. I shouldn't say it started here, but there was a strong feeling for egalitarianism, for equality for women out here. So that Colorado and Wyoming were among the first two places women did get the right to vote. Um, so there was a different way of looking, if you will, at women out here. And then you have this whole issue of women being able to do the same jobs. Now, here's the same job that the men and women did. Women rode bucking bulls and bucking broncos back then, and they were just as good at it as the men were. So Buffalo Bill had women riding bucking animals in his Wild West show. He had women like Annie Oakley shooting and performing as well and out shooting men. So in a way, he was kind of hitting, if you will, striking a note here that women could do the same as a man and could do it just as well. So he's already doing that almost subliminally in the way he uses his performers on his show. But he had this strong sense for women. As I told you earlier, he when his mother died, he went on that bender and ended up joining the army because he loved his mother so much. And there's a letter that is in the collection of the museum up on Lookout Mountain, where a woman writes about meeting Buffalo Bill. She herself was a suffragist, and she says Buffalo Bill is a strong advocate for women getting the vote and for women having equal rights because of his love for his dear mother. So, and he actually is quoted in newspapers saying women should be able to um, get the right to vote. They should be able to hold jobs that men hold, and if they do the same kind of work, they should be paid the same.
Yeah.
So He's the kind of guy that you can say in a day where we are sort of short on heroes, it seems, that he is a truly heroic person in the past. Like everybody, he made his mistakes, but generally you look at him and he represents a lot of the things that we believe in today. Equal rights for all. He believes in saving nature. He was very strong in his support of Teddy Roosevelt and his efforts to preserve wild areas in the American West. He was very supportive and spoke out in favor of them and what they were trying to do. So he's a good guy.
All right, now before we get into the last end of the questions, um, I got to know a little more if there is anything known, particularly going all the way back to him doing videos with Thomas Edison. Yeah, because I didn't know. It's like of all things, why didn't he like? Why wasn't his first videos of He didn't have Buffalo Bill himself do anything?
That's a good question. Why didn't he have Buffalo Bill do it? Sometimes it's access. Maybe at the time Buffalo Bill wasn't available. It's hard to say. Buffalo Bill was certainly not averse to having himself filmed. And there are many photographs taken of him. And later on, there's a film of him and one of the Lakota chiefs who is part of his group, Iron Tail. And they're doing sign language. They're demonstrating how they did sign language back in the early days when different tribes would meet or when the scouts were trying to communicate with different tribal peoples, all of whom had different languages and had to find ways to communicate in that sign language was how they did it. So,
Remarkable. That's awesome. All right, Steve. I do want to give you the moment before we end this. Do you have anything you want to cover?
well, I've obviously gone on quite a bit about various things. I think I've, you know, covered perhaps the strongest points, although certainly uh, I could do a brief commercial pitch, which would be basically to say my book, Galloping Gourmet Eating and Drinking with Buffalo Bill, is available. You can get it through a variety of outlets, as is my book, Buffalo Bill, Scout, Showman, Visionary. So you can find more. And the Scout Showman Visionary, to give it a little bit of a pump, there's about 200 images in there showing all sorts of performances going on, here, period photographs of performances, artifacts are in there, and things like that. And that's proven to be pretty popular because basically it's a picture is worth 1,000 words. So theoretically, there's close to 200,000 words in there in the form of pictures. So,
Yes, very much. Um, yeah, and I look forward to reading it now.
well, good. And thank you so much for giving me a chance to chat about my favorite figure, one of my favorite persons in history, Buffalo Bill.
Well, I can clearly see why after this interview. And thank you again, Steve.